Also joining us is Professor Idan Dershowitz, author of The Valediction of Moses, which suggests that the Shapira Scrolls were authentic and are an early version of the Book of Deuteronomy, perhaps even 2,700 years old. Hello and welcome, and let's start with what evidence supports your theory.
In my book, I bring various different types of evidence. I address the arguments that were made for forgery and show that they're very weak arguments. I also discuss certain documents that I found in an archive in Berlin that were previously unknown that are very difficult to reconcile with the idea that Shapira forged the documents or thought that they were forgeries, because we see that in his private notes he was working really hard to understand the text, and he was making mistakes in his interpretation of the text, and these things don't jive with the idea that he created it or was complicit in the text's creation. But most of all, what I do to build the authenticity case is analyze various different passages in this text, in the Valediction of Moses, and try to read them in light of the Book of Deuteronomy and understand what their genetic relationship, as it were, is. We can see that the text that we have in the Valediction of Moses was edited in various ways that turned it into what we have in the Book of Deuteronomy, but not vice versa.
And what are the main differences between the Shapira Scroll and the version that we know today as Deuteronomy?
So the most dramatic difference between this text and the Book of Deuteronomy is that it does not contain the legal code that gives Deuteronomy its name. So the Book of Deuteronomy is called Deuteronomy, meaning Mishneh Torah, the second law. And it's given that name due to this very large block of text in the middle of the book from chapter 12 through chapter 26, just containing, very, very many laws. That entire corpus of laws is completely absent from the Valediction of Moses. And it's clear that it's not abbreviating it, but rather that, according to the author of the Valediction of Moses, there is no such law code. The only laws that were given in the time of Moses were the laws included in the Decalogue, or the Ten Commandments.
Earlier in the show, we had an interview with author Hanan Tagai, who also claims in his book that he found the so-called smoking gun, which is the ancient Yemenite Torah books, which were used to make the scrolls, supposedly by Shapira. What are your thoughts on that?
I went to see this manuscript myself a few years ago, and it was clear that there was something else going on with the manuscript. So that manuscript had suffered severe water damage on the bottom part, and you can still see that. And it seems quite clear that what happened is that someone cut off the bottom margin to protect the rest of the manuscript, including the important text, from rotting, which was what was happening due to this water damage. And this is something that we see elsewhere. It's in his book, Hanan Tagai makes cutting off margins to be an extremely unusual, rare thing, but it's actually not particularly unusual. And in this particular case, it's clear why it occurred, and there were no nefarious. We don't need any theory that there were nefarious objectives. Furthermore, the margins are, the dimensions don't really work. It's not sufficiently tall, and so on. So it really is quite clear that he did not find the smoking gun.
Meanwhile, Professor Israel Knoll, who we're going to interview next, claims in his article that the Shapira Scroll is a forgery. He uses an example by analyzing the word edut, a testimony or a commandment in Hebrew, and claims that it was in use only in much later Hebrew texts. What are your thoughts about that?
His reading edut in this place in the text is arguable, and in fact is not the way that I or Professor Patel read that word. We read it instead as adat, So it's a totally different word. That's the first thing. So his entire argument is based on his interpretation of these three letters in the Hebrew text. The next issue is that he seems to be making this mistake of assuming that the earliest date in which we have a confirmed reading of a particular word with a particular meaning is when that word came into existence, which is surely not correct. So we have these ideas. There's terminus postquem and terminus antequem, these Latin technical terms, but the point is that certain evidence can tell us what the earliest possible time that we can date something to, or the latest possible time. And he took something which tells us the latest time at which we could attribute the creation of this word with this meaning, and instead says that that's the earliest time. Because if we have the word ed meaning witness, we have the suffix ut meaning abstraction of the attached noun, and that's how people created abstract nouns in the First Temple period, then there's nothing unusual about this form. It would be totally natural for someone from that period